Okay, well, we might as well get started. I'm gonna share my screen really quickly. Um, Alrighty, well, hello everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I know everybody has a lot going on with all of the COVID nonsense and still trying to operate your businesses. But today's webinar is going to focus on the milk crisis plan that was introduced recently by the National Milk Producers Federation and IDFA, the International Dairy Foods Association. It's my understanding that they submitted it to the USDA, and so we have Paul Bleiberg with National Milk Producers on with us today to give us an update. Before we get started, I just want to let you know that if you have any questions or want to ask Paul or me a question at any time, feel free to use the Q&A feature. It should be at the bottom of your screen. You can type your questions in there and I'll do my best to moderate those. Or you can also click the raise your hand button. When I see that come through on my screen, I can unmute your microphone and that'll allow you to speak with us and everybody can hear you. Another note that I would like to point out is we are recording this webinar today. And so once I get that recording from Zoom, I will upload that to the website. And we also have a new Facebook group that I will share the recording of the webinar in as well. The links to our website are on the screen as well as the Facebook group. We encourage you to join the Facebook group. We'll also be sharing other information that you guys might find helpful later on in that platform. So with that, like I said, we have Paul joining us today. Paul is the Vice President of Government Relations at National Milk Producers. He leads the advocacy efforts before Congress, focusing on the Farm Bill policy, taxation, nutrition, environment, and immigration. Clearly, he has so much time on his hands and is not busy at all handling those issues. He also coordinates with the trade team at National Milk and also runs their PAC. He joined their team in 2016. Before that, he was the Deputy Chief of Staff and the Ledge Director on the Hill back in DC. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen, Paul, and you can take it away.
Thanks so much, Corinne. Can everybody hear me?
I can hear you on my end, so I think we're good.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you for the opportunity to provide an update this afternoon. And what I think I'll do is just give a brief overview of the milk crisis plan and a brief update on the discussions that have taken place as we understand them, and then open it up for folks to ask questions, and we can go from there. So I think to start off, obviously, as we started down the road of thinking about how to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on the dairy industry, we were trying to look first and foremost at the fundamental economic impact we were seeing from all of the demand closures, if you will. The demand destruction is the term we've been using between all of the food service cancellations, hotels, restaurants, schools, everything. You end up with something like half of the cheese and almost 2/3 of the butter in the country that goes through those channels not having a home where it can otherwise go. And because it's very difficult and sometimes impossible to repurpose a processing plant, especially in a short amount of time, you have a large amount of milk that has no home. So far we've estimated that to be about a 10% gap in supply and demand, and obviously that could increase over time here. We don't really know what the time frame is for reopening things. Obviously it depends on the health impacts of the virus itself. So I think what we saw was a very significant economic impact resulting from the pandemic right out the gate, and we had to think through what sort of policy solutions were we going to propose. Now, there were several that we proposed right off the bat. About 3 weeks ago, we sent a letter to the Department of Agriculture outlining these. They all made it into the final version of the milk crisis plan as well. Just to recap, this was reopening the dairy margin coverage program so that producers who hadn't signed up before could take advantage of it. Making a substantial purchase of multiple dairy products using Section 32 funds and other similar sources to make sure that we're moving product that we can move and getting into the hands of the food insecure right now, as opposed to buying up product and putting it in warehouses and storing it and things like that. That's not what we were not what we were looking to do. And then the third item was a program to compensate producers for milk disposal. Obviously, you have a lot of milk being dumped around the country. There have been programs set up in the past, like the WIP program in last year's disaster bill that would compensate farmers for disposed milk. So we put forward those three ideas initially. As the days went on after we sent that initial correspondence, and we started to see these numbers I just described really, really magnifying as far as the amount of milk dumping. It wasn't just individual farms, it was tanker loads of milk as a plant as well. And we realized something was going to have to be done here to get supply and demand into balance, even if just in the short term. So over the course of several days, we went through a broad negotiation with our counterparts at IDFA and ultimately came to an agreement that became the milk crisis plan we put forward about 9 days ago now. And that plan included the items I just described, but it also included an additional proposal to attempt to balance milk supply. And what we proposed was essentially a voluntary direct payment program that would run from April through to September. And the way this would work is if a producer wants to be part of the program, they would be able to get paid a $3 per hundredweight payment on 90% of their March 2020 production, as long as they reduced that other 10%. They cut the other 10% relative to that March number, they would be able to get a direct payment on the other 90% of that. Now, this is a monthly program as we conceived it, to run for 6 months through the end of September, which we felt was roughly the right amount of time, not just to deal with the immediate months we're in right now, but to get to the end of this and make sure that we solve the problem correctly without going so long as to cause an inadvertent supply problem on the back end. And we did build in a suspension trigger through our discussions where the program would be turned off for a given month if the average of the class 3 and the class 4 price rose to $16 a hundredweight. The program will be suspended for that particular month, and then it would obviously go back on in the next month if the price went below that level. So this was a temporary concept, a voluntary concept for the producer, whereby they would have the option to do this, but obviously there'd be the incentive in the form of the direct payment. And if they weren't part of the program, they wouldn't have to reduce any production, but they wouldn't be getting that payment either. So that's what we proposed there. In addition to that proposal and the other pieces I already talked about, we had some points on loans to processors to help them manage financial risk, some flexibility on nutrition, some points about additional funding for some of the nutrition programs, like the SNAP program and the Healthy Fluid Milk Incentive Program, and some of that might need to be done legislatively, but we wanted to put it forward in that context. And then a comment or two on food aid and the importance of getting food wherever we could get it. That was the broad proposal that we submitted a little over a week ago, as I said. Since that time, we've been having a lot of discussions about the proposal as much as possible within the industry. A lot of members in Congress and both political parties have been weighing in, urging the Department of Agriculture to do as much as possible for dairy in that context. And, especially given that funding was provided to USDA under the CARES Act to the tune of $9.5 billion to assist a number of different ag sectors with coronavirus impacts. We're hopeful that there's an opportunity here using some of that funding, as well as possibly other funding that the Commodity Credit Corporation has on hand, to do a number of these items here to help the dairy industry. So we've submitted the plan. We've had as many conversations as we can really have out there in the industry. We understand that USDA is working very quickly to get something done. Not just for dairy, but for a whole number of commodities. They're trying to find a path forward on how to provide assistance for people. We don't know exactly what form that's going to take. Obviously, we've put forward what we've put forward. There have been some alternative takes on our plan that folks have seen, and I'm happy to comment and answer questions to the degree that people have those. And I think we know that the department is going to do something fairly soon. We don't know if we'll hear something at the end of this week or early next at the latest, but they've been working quite feverishly. We have been hearing that some kind of a payment program is in the mix. Whether or not it has a supply element to it remains to be seen. And we have also been hearing quite a bit on interest in product purchases, not just for dairy, but for other products as well, which also goes for payment limits. So that's maybe the update that I'll give at a high level. Corinne, I'm happy to sort of take questions from people here on anything I said or any elements of this that I didn't cover. Would you like me to start with the question I see in the chat, or do you want to open it up? Anything, what would you prefer?
Yeah, let's go ahead and start with the chat. I see we have a question from Jeff, and then from there we can just open it up to more questions.
Okay, so the question that's in the chat, I don't know if everybody can read the chat or not, but the question in the chat says, how about a tail tide on this extended past September to maintain some production increase jumping up after September? So I think my sense on that question would be that, I should have said this earlier. It's fairly unprecedented that we were able to reach an agreement between National Milk and IDFA on some kind of a supply concept like this. And so I think one of the things that definitely came up in those discussions was making sure that we came up with a program that dealt with the supply demand issue that we're facing here, but didn't have longer term impacts beyond that, other than the hopeful positive long term impact of making sure that we have a viable dairy industry on the other side of this. So I this would go past September. I'd be surprised if there were consensus, Jeff, in that direction. I think we'd probably lose potentially some of the support for the concept in that case, because we don't know how long this is all going to last. But I think by October, for instance, I don't know that we expect to still be in this situation for the most part. So that'd be my take on that, just from a reality standpoint. The next question I see, what is the estimated cost of the NMPF IDFA proposal? And then does USDA seem to be concerned about cost or policy implications of NMPF proposal, or both? So I'll do those separately. I'll try to take them one at a time. So the first question, estimated cost, Peter Vitaliano, our economist, has run numbers on some aspects of this. And as I talk about cost, I'll try to explain where we think the different parts of our proposal would be funded. We currently estimate the cost of the milk balancing direct payment piece to be about $2.8 billion, I believe. We anticipate our proposal on milk disposal, milk dumping, to be around 400 and something million, maybe 300 and something million, give or take, in that space. Those two items we fully expect would have to be funded out of that $9.5 billion pot of funding that I mentioned from the CARES Act. Now, there are a number of other proposals we put forward, including reopening DMC. As it relates to reopening DMC, were that to be done, I think that would more likely be funded out of the Commodity Credit Corporation, because that's an existing program, that's an entitlement, it's already on the books. It wouldn't need a new funding source. And then as it relates to product purchases, there are any number of ways you could fund product purchases, and we don't have a set cost there as to what that would be. It might have to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars for it to be effective in the way that we want. But that could be funded out of Section 32 funds, which are a fraction of customs receipts. I think it's a third of annual customs receipts that are done every year by Congress. This is appropriated. It could be done out of CCC. Could even be done under the $9.5 billion, but it doesn't have to be. Or it could be done out of programs like the TFAP, the Emergency Food Assistance Program, that got some additional funding both in the CARES Act and the Families First Coronavirus Response Act that preceded it. So there are a few different pots of money from which you can fund product purchases. As it relates to the processor initiatives, USDA might have some pots of money, whether that's CCC, to fund those. I'm not entirely sure whether USDA thinks they have the authority to do those or not, but a couple of different options that might exist there. So as to the second question that was asked here, Jeff, does USDA seem to be concerned about cost or policy implications of the proposal, or both? On the cost side, it's a little hard to know. Obviously, they think they have a $9.5 billion pot to work with, and they can only spend so much on each commodity. So I said 2.8 billion being our estimate on the balancing piece, a few hundred million being our estimate on the dumping piece. Maybe that's enough money where you could spend the money on dairy and not have to do any more, but I don't know. On the policy implications, it's been hard to get a clear sense. I think there is some question we've picked up as to whether or not they want to consider a supply management program of any kind. There may just be concern about the setting up something like that through the government and just wanting industry to do that kind of thing itself. They may also not like the idea of tying the direct payment setup to a cut like that. It's a little unclear. I'm kind of speculating there just because we have picked up feedback that they want to do a direct payment for a lot of different commodities, but we haven't really gotten a clear sense that they are wanting to do something on the supply piece. So I think we'll know for sure when we see what they propose, or what they not propose, what they indicate they're going to do. But it's a little tough to know. Next question, I'll read this one off. Can you elaborate more on the 10% reduction for dairies with multiple locations or families with multiple entities? Now, how will the 10% reduction be determined? We didn't get that specific in the proposal. We came up with something that was very broad, as I said. Maybe Corinne, you could go back. I think you got there on the slide. on the screen. Yeah, you can go back down to where you were. You were in the right spot. I'm sorry, I wasn't looking correctly. The baseline is March 2020. So in other words, the calculation will be based off of what was produced in the previous month. So I think if you had multiple different operations, I think that those would all be calculated based on March. So I'm not sure that if you had multiple entities or locations, I don't think you'd be prevented from including that production in the calculation. I assume it would be based on the overall, but obviously that would be to be determined by USDA. But we've put forward here is an extremely broad framework that doesn't address all of those details. I'm telling you kind of how I think it would probably be addressed, but obviously that would ultimately be subject to the department. Next question I see here, why cut supply based off of March? Supply will naturally be cut due to more dry cows and hot weather during the 6-month period. Why not cut supply by a slightly smaller percent, but tie it to supply from April to September of 2019? That question's actually come up in our discussions. I think we used March partly because we thought, well, March is maybe the last month where you fully didn't have the impacts of the pandemic baked in, so it was a fairly straightforward baseline to use March. I think in some of the other discussions that are going on outside of this program, March has been used as a benchmark for things, even some economic analysis. But obviously, that's a good question. We've had it raised by folks in a number of states since we made our proposal. Could you base it on kind of a year over year along the lines of what your question is, so that you deal with the natural cut that you reference a little more easily? And again, kind of like the answer I gave on the 10% details, that's the kind of detail that could be hashed out a little bit more with USDA. Were they willing to get into the weeds on this kind of overall concept and figure that out? And at this point, we just don't know where they're going to be on the bigger picture. And so without knowing that, it's hard to know how to sort of suss out a lot of the details. Next question, how do payment caps enter into USDA's consideration? That's a really good question. And I would say, well, actually, I see the next question also just popped up. I've heard that there may be a limit to the total dollar payout per producer. Is there a potential truth to that? So these two questions are kind of the same, so I'll try to take them together. The trade aid payments from 2018 and 2019 both had payment limits attached to them. We have heard that payment limits are in play. We don't know what the numbers are going to be. The 2018 payment limit was 125,000 combined on the dairy livestock side. The 2019 was 250,000. I've heard rumors ranging from it's going to be 250 to it's going to be somewhat higher than that, but we don't have a number for how high. We are trying to make the point that we don't think payment limits should be put in place here, because if you do that, you're going to prevent a lot of the milk in the country from being able to be covered. And it's really important to understand that everybody understand that the entire dairy industry is being affected by what's going on here, regardless of size. And so we're concerned about any kind of arbitrary limit that's going to cause larger producers to be in a situation where they cannot receive coverage on their milk, because this crisis is impacting everybody. And if we want to have a viable industry after this to feed everybody, we're going to have to maintain our farms. So we are very concerned and have been weighing in aggressively today, all week, last week, with not just USDA, but frankly with the White House as well. A number of members of Congress have been engaged on this question too. So quite a bit of engagement there. We don't know what's going to end up happening to the question, but that's something I wanted to lay out. The related piece to this, and I don't think either of the questions touched on it, is adjusted gross income. I will note that the trade aid packages initially had a $900,000 adjusted gross income limitation, both 2018 and 2019. And then last year, in a piece of legislation that they passed around that time, Congress created a waiver for the AGI requirement that said if more than 3/4 of your business are derived from farming, ranching, and forestry, you'd be exempt from that $900,000 AGI limit. So we have not heard that there's going to be an AGI limit. Obviously, an AGI limit would be extremely concerning, because you would be blocking certain farms out from the program altogether. A payment limit, you're still allowed in. There's a limit on how much you'd be able to get paid on. So neither are good, but an AGI limit is even bigger catastrophic problem. We've not picked up intel that there's going to be an AGI limit. We have heard quite a bit on payment limit. It's important to note that USDA isn't required by law, as we understand it, to do payment limits, but politics often come into play here, unfortunately, when you talk about these kinds of programs. And so we're pushing very hard on that, to both Jeff's question and Travis's question, but we don't know the answer yet.
So Paul, that actually might be a good segue. We do have a question in the Q&A chat. I'm not sure you can see it on your end, but the question is, are the chances of the 10% reduction happening, hurt by the letter that the 24 senators sent to USDA the other day?
Well, there were two letters. There was a letter sent by some Democratic senators and a letter sent by some Republican senators. But no, I don't think the chances would be hurt because there have been members in both parties that have weighed in support of the concept. And frankly, I think my guess here is the thinking that is the thinking behind the question that because the letter was from Democratic senators, therefore USDA won't want to do it. If that's the thinking behind the question, my answer would be I don't think that's the case. I think there's support from both parties in a number of corners on Capitol Hill for something like this. And even if the Trump administration is more interested in trying to make Republicans happy than make Democrats happy, which might be the case, I don't think the letter hurts by any means. I think it helps to show that there's cross-regional support, given that that letter was signed by senators from all over the country. And we have also had Republicans weighing in on a number of ways as well. So no, I don't think it hurts. Then I see, Corinne, you have a question. Did somebody ask this question about?
Yeah, I actually think this is from a producer, Art. I gave him my login.
Oh,
My
sure. So
website.
would it be better to offer whole dairy buyout rather than 10% reduction? Hard to say on that. I don't really know how USDA would respond. To that type of concept and what memories it would evoke from some past programs. So I'm not sure that I think it would be particularly saleable at the department, unfortunately, but don't have a ton of insight. Looking back to Travis here in the queue, we have a follow-up. Minnesota Milk's plan is distinctively different on a lack of supply reduction. What are political issues that may arise with Congressman Peterson's position as House Ag Chair, despite support from by NMPF and its Minnesota-based members, LOL and AMPI? So I don't want to get into all the political stuff. Frankly, that's not necessarily great for me to do all that. But I think what I will say is on the Minnesota Milk plan, yes, their plan is a bit different. They proposed something that sort of is modeled off of ours, but it doesn't have the supply reduction piece. I think what we proposed, as I said earlier, is a 6-month program where you would get paid $3 a hundredweight each month on your production. If you cut by 10%, they do sort of a lump sum one-time payment for 3 months where they do $9 a hundredweight. And then I believe they say 3 months in, I think July, you would reevaluate whether to go forward. So they kind of used a similar construct there, just modifying the calculation. But the big difference, obviously, is the lack of supply reduction. I think they preferred not to have that in there. We felt that it's important to have it in there. Yes, it is public that Congressman Peterson has endorsed their plan in a press release that Milk put out last week. They stated that. Unclear what that all means. Obviously, it's very conceivable that as I said earlier, the Department of Ag will try to do some kind of payment program for all commodities, and they won't want to do a supply management thing, but a little bit hard to know. Next question. When MPP was in development, there was a supply management component that was cut due to lack of political will. Do you think there was an opportunity to implement an ongoing supply component to margin management programs? If the question is about the dairy margin coverage, I would say no, I don't think so. I would say Congress worked really hard over the course of a couple of years to get a certain amount of consensus around improving the dairy margin coverage, as well as some other improvements that were made in the dairy risk management space. I would be very, very surprised if there were political will to modify DMC to include a supply component. I just don't think it would be there. That's not to say some people wouldn't support that. They might. I just think, broadly speaking, I don't think there would be the kind of agreement that you would need to have in Congress for something like that. I think what we've talked about here is a temporary proposal. That's a voluntary proposal that's separate from the DMC, and that's part of why we were able to get the consensus, because, as I said earlier, it's pretty unprecedented that IDFA is willing to support something in this space. The fact that they are goes to how bad this situation is right now. And so to put an ongoing supply management piece into this underlying farm safety net, I think would probably not get a lot of traction. There might be some people that would support it. I don't think there would be enough people that would support that for it to get done. So I think there's a distinction needs to be made between what we propose, which is a temporary solution, given the situation we're in, and something more permanent. Now, if something is done temporarily, yes, that sets a precedent that something was done temporarily, and then when you go 3 years from now to the 2023 Farm Bill or whatever, who knows what kinds of conversations will occur, but I don't want to set the wrong expectations there. I don't see any others, Corinne, in the box. Are there others that people have sent you?
Not on my end. So I guess with that, does anybody, if you
Yeah,
have more
you want
questions,
to give people a minute or two to write anything else in
yeah,
case?
sure. Or like I mentioned at the beginning, you can also raise your hand. I believe the button is down at the bottom of your screen, and that will, I can give you guys access to talk if you guys don't want to type your question. Let's see, someone's raising their hand. Give me a second. Shoot, it's not showing me who it was.
It looks like he's unmuted and ready to go. Bruce Burrows. If Bruce, can you hear me? Go ahead and ask your question. Guess not.
Okay. Guess it wasn't Bruce.
He's got the hand up.
This is, can anybody hear me?
Yeah, hey,
Yeah,
Arlen.
Okay, hey, this is Arlen Van Groningen. I just had a question. Thanks for doing this, by the way. And I was just wondering how quick, in your opinion, something like this can be implemented, and how much resistance we're getting. I mean, we're all sitting here talking about it, but the fact of the matter is, I mean, time is kind of the essence here. Huh?
Yeah, well, in terms of the timing, that's a good question. So let's just say USDA were to make an announcement on Monday of next week. They might make an announcement sooner, but yeah, let's just pretend they made an announcement on Monday next week, and let's pretend that they said they were going to do this. Because this is sort of an expedited situation, we don't think they would have to go through a whole formal rulemaking process as they do sometimes with programs that they unveil, because they were given fairly broad authority right now to do a number of things to help people in response to the pandemic. So it could take several weeks, obviously, to set it up, just from the standpoint of deciding on all of the details, because a lot of you asked really good questions in here about some of the details, just looking back, whether it be the question about, which production baseline to use, last year versus March, would multiple ownership, multiple entities, how to deal with that. Those are all important questions that, we kind of don't touch on in a lot of detail. We reference a baseline as March 2020, but there certainly be a lot of perspectives on that if they were to go forward. So there would be a certain amount of time where you'd want to be able to hash that out. Maybe it doesn't have to be more than a couple of weeks, but I wouldn't want to misrepresent that that'd be in 2 days, right? So could take a few weeks to do. I think, we've proposed this concept to be April to September, but it could in theory be retroactive, and maybe that actually helps to answer one of the questions that I see popping up here with the timing of the program. Somebody wrote out a question where they said, joining in late, so apologize, but with the program potentially starting up May 1 instead of April 1, would the milk baseline be changed from March to April? I think the idea would be that the program would probably be retroactive to April 1, in theory. That doesn't mean USDA would exactly do that, but that's a good question as well, because it would depend on when you start, and then depending on when you start, what do you set the baseline at, and whether or not April would make sense as a baseline if production has already gone down. It's hard to say. Maybe, probably hasn't, but maybe there's been a lot of milk dumped. So I don't know that the baseline would have to change, because USDA is able to do things retroactively. But in terms of overall time, to the question that was asked, it could take a couple of weeks, but it's hard to know. I see another question on here. Would the payment be on 90% of the March production, regardless of what was produced during the period April through September? As we've proposed it, yes. The way we've said is March is the baseline, as in our proposal. So for the entirety of that 6-month period, as long as the program is in for a given month, you get a payment on 90% of the March level. Yeah.
And this is Travis. That 10% reduction has to be in each of those months, right?
Yeah, you'd have to make that same reduction every month in order to be eligible for a payment. Yeah. If you sign up for the program, the idea would be that you'd be making that cut over that, each month across that whole time. In other words, your April production would have to be 10% less than March, your May production would have to be 10% less than March, June, and so on and so forth, unless the suspension trigger were to kick in which case the program would be shut off for that given month, and then you wouldn't have to do that.
So if there's months that you make it and months that you don't, can you still get the payment on the months that you qualify for?
That's a good question. We don't have a stipulation in what we've proposed, I think, for what happens if a producer signs up for the program and then doesn't make that 10% threshold. That's a good question, and one that would have to be resolved in the process of working this out with USDA. I'm not sure how that would go. I see a written question. What do the cattle guys think of this plan? They've not weighed in formally, from what I can tell. Anecdotally, I know there's a lot of concern about the beef market right now, but they obviously there's a lot in the cattle world being discussed around the USDA investigation that's ongoing and other asks that are being made. I just don't know if our request is top of mind for them or not, given that they have a lot of their own stuff they're focused on. That's not to say they've waited in support, because I've not seen that, but I haven't seen them say anything else. They may be quietly opposing it behind the scenes for all I know, but I haven't heard that from anybody yet. Any other questions people want to either type in or anything anybody wants to ask?
I don't see anything on my end, but again, folks, if you do want to ask a question, instead of typing it in, feel free to raise your hand and I can give you access to talk. Oh, and we have a couple questions that just came in the Q&A. Should be encouraged that USDA has not yet announced. I'm not exactly sure what Jeff is asking there.
And then I see the second comment. I'll let Jeff, you might want to, if there's something else you're asking there, to take a second to clarify. Bruce, I see it's going to be hard to cut April milk now by 10%. That's true. That's a good point. And so given the way this is proposed, and that goes to the earlier question too, while USDA can set things up retroactively, obviously for the month of April, we're already halfway through. And by the time anything could be announced or finalized, we'd be even more than that. So you might have to adjust when the program starts. Whether the baseline changes, I'm not totally sure whether you'd have to adjust the baseline, but that's a valid point, Bruce, that it would be tough to do that. So it would probably require some adjustment in the process for April. Yeah. Jeff, did you want to ask something?
Yeah, my question, Paul, was, we'd heard some discouraging things over the weekend. We're into Wednesday. We haven't seen anything from USDA. We've heard from the president a couple of times saying, hey, USDA is going to do something. So it just seems like the fact that they haven't announced, I'm taking that it would have been easier for them to just announce that they were going to, send us some checks. I guess I'm hoping that there's some contemplation there inside of USDA trying to figure out how to actually do the proposal that National Milk put forward, and that takes more time. Is that Pollyannish on my part?
No, I think that's a good. I mean, I hope that's the case too. I think there are a few other considerations here. Right? My sense is overall, Jeff, whatever they do, not just for dairy but for everybody, they're probably going to announce it all at the same time. So they could be having to think through issues in a whole bunch of buckets, obviously. But to your point, yeah, that's true. There's been a lot of congressional pressure over the last 4 or 5 days, especially on this issue, as well as now, as I said earlier, on the payment limit issue. So it's possible that that's also something they're having to rethink. Maybe we were going to have a really low payment limit, and maybe now we will have a higher payment limit. You never know. So it's possible that you're right, and that there's some degree of good news that may come from the delay. But I guess we won't know for sure till we know. Then Lance, I see you got a question. I'll just read this out here. We agree that tying payments to a production cut was wise. Payments not tied to a cut would not fix the problem of excess milk. Please do your best to not change procedure on this. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think we agree with that point. I think obviously we want to get help to producers, but if you don't deal with this underlying, problem, right, you may end up losing farms in the long run, even if they get a payment right now. That's not to say that maybe they'll do a larger payment than they've done before, and that's better than what they did in trade aid. But I think there's still a concern that if they just do a payment and they don't do anything on the supply piece, that we wouldn't be in a position to be able to weather this. And we keep saying we want to have a dairy industry on the other side of this. And when this is all done, and I think what we propose is a way to make sure that's the case. And we are concerned that if you don't do it that way, you will lose a lot more milk production in a lot of farms that we don't want to lose. I see a question here. I guess we're talking about on the small business side. Is the Paycheck Protection Program fully funded or out of money at the moment? If it's not out of money yet, it's very close to being out of money. And so one of the things you're probably seeing in the press right now is that Republicans and Democrats are kind of going back and forth right now, and also negotiating with Treasury Secretary Mnuchin on some kind of an agreement to pass a bill fairly quickly here. Whether it'll pass this week or next week is I'm unsure of. That would replenish that PPP pot of money by a certain amount. I've heard 250 billion is a amount some people want, and so I think we hope that they reach some agreement and that can happen, because otherwise a lot of people that need money out of that may not be able to get it. But if they're not totally out of money, we think they're close. So. Any other questions?
Yeah, Paul, I just think you're doing a great job, and you really articulated. I mean, the reason to ask the federal government to step in here is that the federal government they made a public policy decision that shutting the economy down to save the healthcare system was something they had to do. The reason they're given, past the 2.2 trillion was to preserve the economic capacity of the country, while in exchange for saving the healthcare system. Well, we're facing, the cows didn't shut off. Everybody else went home. The schools shut down. Everybody else could shut down. The cows didn't. And we have seen this time and time again, where we build up huge amounts of inventory, and then it hangs over the industry for years and prevents the market from enabling us to provide, the market to provide a profitable price to the dairy industry. So if we don't cut supply, even if those extra solids are going into stored products, and they are going to hang over the industry, and we always run pretty close supply and demand, even when we're in normal times. So big supplies are hugely damaging, and low caps on payments will not protect the actually probably well over a majority of the productive capacity of the dairy farmers in this country. So
well, I think you hit the nail on the head there with the point about these are government mandated closures in response to the healthcare situation. And that's a point that we've made actually to members of Congress and other people who might not normally be supportive of some kind of a supply reduction. One of the reasons we get resistance on supply management sometimes in the industry or in politics is when people say, if you can't bear the market, you shouldn't be doing it, kind of a response is what people will give sometimes. And that's part of why I am skeptical that there would be any sort of will for an ongoing program. But in this context, and you said it really well, this is not the market. This is the government directing the closure of massive parts of the economy, right? I think the numbers we've done, it's something like 50% of the cheese, half of the, more than half of the butter, 60% that I mentioned at the outset here, that are going to be impacted by this because of the lack of food service, restaurants, hotels, schools, catering, everything under the sun. That this is not a market question. This is a government question. So I think you said that really well. And I think, to your point on the payment limit thing, we don't want a lot of producers to be in a difficult situation here that they can't get, endure when this is all done, which is why we're pushing on that too.
Any other questions, folks? I'm not seeing any come through
Okay.
on my end.
All right. Well, if there are no, sorry, go ahead.
Someone raising their hand. Brian, you should be able to unmute yourself and go ahead and start talking.
Yeah, I was just going to ask if you could scroll up.
Oh, sure. Thanks. Where do you want me to stop?
Let's see. You're at producer or processor, I think. Processor.
You want me to go down to processor?
Yeah, I just wanted to see the rest of it there. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, what's on the screen there right now is some loan concepts that IDFA's membership is very interested in to help with liquidity and whatnot right now. So that's part of the agreement there. I'm not as in the weeds on that piece of it, unfortunately, so I might struggle to answer a lot of questions, but that's the background on that piece.
Any more questions, guys? Well, seeing none, I guess with that, we'll wrap up. Paul, thank you so much. Like Jeff said, you articulated all of this very well. We thank you for the time that you've spent with us. I know it's probably crazy busy back in DC right now, but it's always great to talk to you. You fielded the questions excellently. So again, thank you so much, Paul, for joining, and to everybody else that attended, thank you as well. I can send a recording of this call out following the meeting, and I can also include a PDF of the plan. So you all have that. And again, we're gonna start pushing this out in our new Facebook group. Let me see if I can share this better. There we go. So the links to our website is on this slide, as well as the Facebook group. And then if you guys have any ideas for future Zoom calls, there's a Google form link there. Feel free to put that, feel free to put your ideas in that. And hopefully we can accommodate those requests. And last but not least, stay tuned for our next Zoom call. So thank you very much, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you, Corinne, and yeah, thank you for your presentation.
All right. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.